Welcome back, everyone, to A Colder War, our bi-monthly podcast on current developments in warfare, conflict, and peace. Great that you're joining us again. I'm your host, Leaf, and today we're discussing one of the most requested books as of yet, and one that is also extremely timely. I'm talking, of course, about Grégoire Chamayou's drone theory that was released in 2013 with Penguin Books. Chamayou being a French philosopher, drone theory takes on an interesting perspective. The book examines the use of war drones to a philosophical investigation. Chamayou discusses how drones as a means of violence work and what their consequences are. What political and legal implications do they have? How does war and the notion of just violence change? What social relations arise out of the use of drones? Here to discuss these questions with me are three students of conflict that all come from different yet highly relevant scientific disciplines. Thanks for joining us. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ramon, and I study language and culture studies with a focus on conflict studies. And my background is in international relations and US politics.
Well, hello, Liv. Thanks for having me. My name is Wolf, and I'm majoring in human geography. And I would love to bring some insights I might have into this discussion.
Hi, my name is Leah, and I come from a background in business administration, so completely different in project and change management, focused on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I look forward to our conversation.
So do I. Drones are, of course, a highly controversial topic. So before we dive more deeply into the matter, I would love for us to find a common definition of what exactly war drones are. Wolf, maybe you can enlighten us.
Well, for me, war drones are something like aircrafts, but they're not. There's not a person flying them, like literally within them, but they're flown remotely. And you have all kinds of drones. They can be equipped with cameras for some light use, or, for example, to record a phone notification you might have. But in this case, we're going to talk about more serious drones loaded with weapons, and these come in all sizes and shapes as well.
Yeah, indeed. And drones have, of course, a rather interesting history, also a rather recent history. They've only been developed in the Vietnam War, and then mostly for gathering intelligence. And only since the onset of the 21st century have they actually been used as weapons, so armed with guns. So right off the bat, I would like to start you guys by asking what your impression of the book was. Did it trigger any sort of emotional response, and why do you think that is?
Well, for me, I had some knowledge of drone warfare and drone use, but I was still taken aback by the implications of the drone, the situation on the ground when a power such as the United States used drones, like in areas in Pakistan and Yemen, and it was to me really vivid at the same time. And from a policy level, I was still quite astounded how deterministic in nature these drones seem to be, and the policy involved. It's going in a direction no sensible person would even dare to call right or good. And yeah, that was my first take after I finished the book.
So there's clearly a moral dimension to the use of drones. Leah, could you maybe elaborate why exactly drones change the morals of warfare?
Well, I think Chamayou goes onto many different arguments, as he's also his background is in philosophy. But I think one of the main arguments he makes is about the asymmetrical warfare, or the unilateral warfare, or dimensions that drone warfare has come to. Whereas before you have more this combat war, right, where you maybe have two sides opposed to each other and they go into battle, and both sides are at risk of death, of injury. And then it's usually the side that has technological advantages, has more money, etc., that will most likely win a war. And now with drones, it is basically drone operators thousands of kilometers away from the actual war zone, committing violence, basically, with no possibility of retaliation.
Yeah, interesting. What kind of impacts do you think does that type of warfare have on the local populations that are kind of exposed to the use of drone warfare?
Well, in the book, he gives the example of, I think, terrorist groups basically wanting to recruit members and saying it was quite difficult even to recruit 5 members before there was a drone strike. And an American drone strike comes and there's 150 people willing to give their lives for the cause. So actually, contrary to what one might think, that these drone attacks can reduce terrorism by basically destroying the nodes in the networks, they actually can create counterinsurgencies and terrorism. Yeah.
But how bizarre is that? I mean, one of the main objectives that the U.S. military has publicly stated in their operations in the Middle East, for instance, are the war against terror, right? How they like to phrase it themselves. And now we have all these stories that tell that actually the way they are fighting these wars is counterproductive to their own objectives. Why could the U.S. still pursue this policy? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think it's really a thing of power and of money, of course, because it's relatively very cheap to fight wars from miles away using drones. That's much cheaper than really putting men on the ground and make them fight with each other. And I think that's what the US thinks about the most, is just economics and power for them, and not necessarily, maybe they've lost the sight on this war on terror and are just driving their own goals. That's what I think.
Yeah. To what extent, I mean, the use of drones creates quite a sharp distinction between us versus them. So much to the extent that us, the American soldiers' life has to be spared at whatever cost necessary, while the lives of civilians in Yemen or Pakistan are readily dispensable. How does the use of drones kind of amplify these boundary drawings, this sorting into new social categories?
Well, if I can chip in, I think what's most important here is that, in my view, is that classical warfare, even if it's from a distance or asymmetrical, unilateral, it's not really warfare anymore when you're being hunted like this, because the drone has essentially been made into a machine that works as a hunter. It has the capability of surveillance and attacking in one. And because of its unilateral nature, people on the ground are not in a fight with the drone, because they can't even see it, or they can't even hear it coming. And in the book, it is stated that one very vivid report of someone in the Middle East describing a drone attack as if a lightning strike hit their position or hit their village. It came out of nowhere. There was no reason for them to be attacked in the first place. So then we veer off into accountability and legality in an instant. And they were being basically blasted from the earth from above, even though there were no actual terrorists near them, and they were just harmless civilians.
And if I can come in real quick on your question regarding the creating of identities, Schroeder and Schmid actually have a really interesting side on this. They wrote a popular paper in 2001, which is really relevant in the conflict literature. And they also talk about narratives and performances. So it's basically like the US, they have to create this image of the other versus us in order to legitimize for themselves, I believe, the usage of drones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, because from these stories that you're telling me now, drones seem like a very inhumane mode of warfare. Civilians, women, children are repeatedly being killed, and there's not even a sense of accountability or a sense of risk of one's own life because drones are essentially unmanned. So I'd actually be, if you could tell me some more about how the US actually tries to legitimize this campaign.
From an ethics standpoint, they've basically redefined the notion of bravery. Because in the past and in past wars that the US has fought, bravery would come out of a sort of individual heroism. But right now, the drone operators need to deal with the fact that they're sometimes thousands of miles away in their home base, maybe based in Texas, and there's no bravery in pushing a button, really, and seeing what it does when it detonates that bomb. Even more so because the other side can't fight back. So the soldier has become an executioner in a way, and it's really hard to redefine what bravery is from that point on, because there's from my standpoint personally, there's no bravery in such an attack. They then go on to legitimize this mode of warfare by calling into history. So they're saying there is nothing more fundamentally new about this situation, so it is perfectly acceptable. I believe that was stated on page 39 in the book. And basically they're saying is, we've done it before, so why not do it now? Well, if you look at that argument, it's not a really good, valid argument, to say the least. And it all boils down for me to, which is also mentioned many times in the book, about self-preservation, really. It's about their side is losing men, and we don't care about them, because the amounts of collateral damage that has been done has been off the charts, but they're not losing any personnel from their side, which makes it very attractive for the Americans, this mode of warfare, because in the past, politics and the selling of war has become more difficult when more people from like rural villages and even from the city, like actual American lives, were lost. It's hard to sell that war when many Americans are dying. And in this type of warfare, it's riskless. No Americans are dying. And I think if you look at it like that, it's a really strong, especially in the United States, it's a really strong narrative to have, and to, especially even though it's coming from the military themselves, there is no opposition to speak of. So Americans as a whole seem to be fine with this, because they're not losing their brothers, their fathers, maybe their sisters. So for me, it's just crooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially with your... Oh, sorry, Leah. Please go ahead.
Chamayou brings another argument into the equation, saying that drones are in public discourse described as precise, as very clean instruments of assassination or elimination. And through this discourse, it makes other weapons of war less moral, in a sense, because they would destroy or they would kill more people. But interestingly enough, which surprised me very much in the book, is the death radius of a drone having 15 meters and a 20-meter destruction radius. So I think if many people would actually understand the repercussions of a drone strike, that it is not this like tiny little bullet that basically kills one person, but it really creates an explosion lasting 15, 20 meters, this might also change the public opinion or acceptability of the drone.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, there's actually very little factual basis to these narratives that the US military is constructing to legitimize this type of warfare. Well, one of the things that we try to do in this podcast is, of course, to zoom out and unbury some of the current developments in conflicts, war, and peace. And one of the overarching topics that we always seem to circle back to is the, so to speak, technologicalization of warfare. I'm thinking, for instance, of Bruder's paper, The New Digital Borders of Europe, where he discusses the EU's plans to construct these huge digital databases that allow EU officials to identify and classify irregular immigrants. Can you see a link between these types of technological developments and maybe the way that drones classify and single out targets?
Well, the relation is the whole discussion on ethics, because we talk about ethics when we talk about, for example, microphones or smart speakers in our home, like what do we want them to listen to and what do we not. But we can also include this ethical discussion, as we've just talked about, on technological weapons, like what is ethical. And then it's not only a question of what does this machine do, but who operates it and why, and who can be targeted, and who decides who can be targeted.
Mm-hmm. But can't you maybe observe a way in which, to an extent, the use of drones and the use of the statistical identification processes that drones use have kind of also represent a way of technology actually taking over the work that humans used to do? I think a striking example, for instance, are these daily habit maps that drones draw about entire populations, kind of trying to establish these networks of where do people usually go, with whom do they speak, and if there is a suspicious variation in their behavior, that person automatically becomes a target without a human actually putting some intelligence into his or her behavior, but simply singling them out. Okay, they had so and so much contact with a person that is already on our list of suspects, so therefore he must also be a terrorist, and we now have the legitimacy to shoot them. I mean, that's quite scary if you read something like this. At least it was to me, because it also shows how technology takes over and becomes completely unaccountable, because you can't put a software in front of a court, right? By letting technology take over, people are also kind of saying like, hey, it wasn't my doing, right? Like, I cannot be held accountable for that.
Well, definitely, I agree, but you can only go as it has to stop at one point. But in the end, because in the end, it's a person who presses the button and not the drone itself who decides, oh, well, I'm just going to fire off a missile right now.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, humans stay in control,
Mm-hmm.
and technology definitely puts them in one direction, but it doesn't have to decide for them.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's being used as an easy getaway. Again, talking about narratives and performances, as well, technology said this to us, so that's why we did it. So I think that's too easy.
Yeah, it's definitely a cheap way to get rid of responsibility. But it still struck me as very interesting, because Demmers, in her article Identity, Boundaries and Violence, she of course describes how social identity is in its essence a social process. You assign identity to yourself, the people around you assign an identity to yourself, but we are observing now more and more is that technology and big data actually does that for us partially as well. We are being assigned a certain identity on Facebook in order to target ads more, and if you are unlucky, you are assigned the status of an irregular immigrant or even a person that should rightfully be killed. Wolf, you of course come from a speciality of space and geography, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this book in terms of your discipline. How do drones impact the notion of space?
Well, it really, so to say, has changed the game, because war had always had a major geographical part as well. Like they were battles on certain grounds, and drones now make it that this does not need the geographical location does not play a role anymore. Like drones can fly over mountains, over hills, over rivers, over everything. So the space where a war takes place does not matter anymore. Demmers and Van Hovens actually wrote about this, as well as creating borders, creating territory. But the drones do not need to keep in mind where a border ends or begins, because they can just fly over it, and who's going to stop one?
In that sense, drones also erode the sovereignty of states. it doesn't really matter anymore whether you actually are officially at war with a nation in order to use drones. You can do it nonetheless in this kind of like what's that called, self justice kind of approach. I thought that was also really interesting.
I think if you continue on the subject of space, if you bring in, I'd like to bring in the article of Shepard and Chiarto from 2008, where they said how spatiality matters in conflict. And the peculiar thing, the shift we are seeing now is that, like Wolf said, armies or combatants used to inhabit geographical space. Now, with this shift towards nodes and networks, or maybe even more locations of certain people, where there's a focus now on where are they going, what are they near to, how often do they go. This focus on big data and zooming in, so to say, with mass surveillance by drones and by other means, they've shifted from their police action. From gathering intel on a person. Those were markers of actual identity, like age, what family they're from, their connections. They've now shifted towards they don't even care about those fundamental markers of identity. They see you from a distance. They can maybe make out you have a weapon, and they're zooming in on that instance, and basically they're redefining the notion of armed conflict. So now it's a mobile place attached to one person, instead of, hey, there's the enemy located, there's a group on geographical space. Now they're just zooming in on one. And it's really, if I can bring in an example, or like maybe all people can relate to, say if I go out on a walk through a forest, like people do, especially now during the COVID pandemic, that wouldn't be flagged as suspicious by anyone. No, I'm just going to a certain area just for my leisure. But that changes when you're in Pakistan, for instance, and there's a forest, but it provides cover. Maybe that's flagged as suspicious because the surveillance drones can't follow you anymore. They can't see you anymore. If you do that often enough, there's a chance you're flagged as an enemy combatant or terrorist affiliated. And you may get targeted, and you may get bombed for that. So it's in that sense, it's a whole paradigm shift, and that is what is so creepy about it. Because where does this end? Sure, they're doing it now in unstable countries with a weak state apparatus. But who's to say that it stops there? Who's gonna stop it anyway? For me, it's really alarming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand that. It kind of makes, if you start to think about the implications of where drone warfare could take us, that's really where the dystopian novel almost starts, in a sense. I think one of the examples that Chamayou gave in his book was also that if you ask US drone operators and US drone developers where they think drone warfare will be in 20, 30 years, what they are talking about are tiny drones that can kill with deadly precision, but yet are also completely removed from accountability because you do not have any civilian casualties. You can basically intervene anywhere. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, Liv, I think you bring an interesting point in that was touched upon by you and by Wolf, Ramon as well. The topic of these blurring of borders, and basically the whole world is a battlefield, and this creates both moral questions but also legal questions. Like the US is in countries like Yemen, etc., that are not officially at war with. So this blurring of borders creates we need completely new laws and moral codes to basically legitimize this presence. And Chamayou goes into various directions, basically trying to find ways of legitimizing this. And I think there is no simple solution. He basically says we need new for this.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to zoom out a little bit and I guess talk about the book in its entirety. What were, in your eyes, points of strength, aspects that you enjoyed while reading, and what did you miss? What could Chamayou have done better?
Well, I think Chamayou definitely was strong in providing a complete picture on current day drone warfare, but also including his own opinions and what he thinks. And by providing both pro arguments for drone usage, but then using his own arguments to counter these pro arguments, his point was very strong. But then after chapter 19, it became very theoretical, and that is where his point lost some strength for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder what others think about it.
I agree. I think by going into classic theory by the likes of Kant and Hegel makes it difficult even for the well-informed reader. And I had to read that section twice in order to understand, but it didn't contribute much to his carefully built up arguments and case against drone warfare, because his strong suit is really examining and laying bare the contested politics revolving this subject and drone warfare, especially from the viewpoint of the United States and to a lesser extent other forerunner nations such as Israel. But then why go into classical theory if your point in the now, so to say, and in the end he veers to the future, which is also very effective in being like a call to arms, like saying we have to do something about this. Then maybe he could have left out that part, like the second to last section. So I agree with Wolf.
For me personally, I really enjoyed the philosophical perspective he was taking, but at some parts I missed some other disciplines' perspective a little bit as well. For instance, the question that we discussed about why the US keeps pursuing this drone warfare policy, despite it being counterproductive to some of their self-proclaimed objectives. That requires like an economic and political analysis, and that he did not give. So that's maybe something that I would add to that. As a final challenge, because we've almost run out of time, if there's one thing that has become apparent from our discussion is that the use of drones and modern war technology in general is concerning because of lack of transparency and thus accountability. So if I may challenge all of you, what steps do you guys think we need to take to resolve these issues? Like, what steps do we need to take to hold our governments more accountable?
Well, for me, it's transparency, and it's going to be really difficult because it's already been proven difficult to implement rules on which drones are allowed to fly over certain backyards. So imagine implementing this in worldwide warfare. But I think that in the end, transparency really has to help in engaging in this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Before I go rambling off again, what are your thoughts on this, Leah?
I agree with Wolf that the first step is, Demers also said this in her lectures, that this is one of her goals and the goals of the intimacies of remote warfare. And I think building on this, I do think legal actions and repercussions need to be put into place for the use of drones. I think that is the next step in order to really hinder civilian populations also from basically the other side of getting hurt. So I think transparency is the first step, public awareness of this issue, and then following this, we do need legal measures in place, international legal measures in place, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think a big part is also raising the awareness about drone warfare, not only amongst academics and experts, but among the wider public in general, create an interest and an awareness about the effects that drone warfare has, put this in the media so that politicians are indeed held accountable by the wider public at large.
and try to refrain from these polarizing debates. I think that are not going to lead to very fruitful outcomes, but this is generally difficult currently. Ramon.
Yeah, I agree with all three of you, and I would like to add that, as Chamayou stated, these developments are championed foremost by what we would call liberal democracies, like the United States and Israel to a lesser extent. So in order to solve that, even not the legal frameworks notwithstanding, we should bring back in the democratic part. And for that, awareness is needed. And for the people to have a say, or for the people, like maybe before that, people to have, if they're aware of this problem, to say, we do not agree with this. And I do not think the general public would be okay with this. And it's very important to bring back the democratic aspect of state apparatus, that we have a say in this. And I don't think people are aware enough that this is happening at a really alarming pace. So yeah, awareness is the first step, and then we can take back control, hopefully.
What nice way to finish the discussion. I had a really great time. It has certainly given me a lot of food for thoughts. What I always realize in these podcasts is how technology, politics, the economy, identity, and space are tangled up and jointly produce violence and conflicts. As always, if you want to participate in the discussion, visit our social media sites. If you have a topic or book that you would like us to discuss next, please let us know there too. Thank you very much to our guests. I had a great time.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for having us.
as always, thanks to our listeners as well. See you in 2 weeks.